My name is Russell Coleman. I am 73 years old, and I need to tell you something that I have never said out loud to anyone, not my children, not my doctor, not even the priest I used to see on Sunday mornings back in Tampa. I gave away $375,000 to a woman I met at a gym in Manila. I gave it away willingly. I gave it away gladly. I gave it away because I was so broken inside that I convinced myself it was love. It wasn't love. It was grief, wearing a beautiful face. And by the time I understood that, the money was gone. My dignity was in pieces, and I was sitting alone in a rented apartment on the other side of the world, wondering how a retired accountant, a man who spent 40 years tracking other people's money, could lose his own so completely. My wife Barbara died on a Tuesday in March of 2018. We had been married for 41 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table even in winter, who laughed at my terrible jokes and made me feel like the most interesting man in any room. When she got sick, I told myself she would fight through it. She was strong. She had always been strong. But pancreatic cancer doesn't care how strong you are. She was gone in 11 weeks from the day they found it. 11 weeks. I didn't even have time to understand what was happening before it was over. After that, I lived like a machine. I woke up. I made coffee. I sat in the chair where she used to read. I went to bed. I woke up again. My son Patrick called every Sunday from Chicago. My daughter Melissa drove down from Atlanta twice a month for the first year. They were worried. I could see it in their eyes every time they looked at me, that careful, watchful fear that parents never expect their children to carry. I told them I was fine. I told them because I believed I was supposed to be fine eventually. And if I said it enough times, maybe it would become true. It never did. 5 years went by like that. 5 years of going through the motions, of being present at family dinners without actually being there, of smiling at the right moments and nodding at the right moments and feeling absolutely nothing except a quiet, steady ache that I had stopped trying to explain to anyone. My doctor, a young man named Dr. Harrington, who I think genuinely cared about his older patients, sat me down one afternoon and said something that changed everything. He said, "Russell, grief that doesn't move becomes a prison. You need a change of scenery, something new, somewhere that Barbara never was, so everything doesn't remind you of her." He suggested travel. He mentioned Southeast Asia specifically, said several of his retired patients had gone to the Philippines and come back looking 10 years younger. I went home that night and booked a flight for 3 weeks later. I arrived in Manila in October of 2023. It was hot and loud and overwhelming and nothing like Tampa, and I remember thinking that at least I wasn't sitting in that chair. My hotel was in Makati, clean and modern, and the staff were so genuinely warm that it caught me off guard. I wasn't used to people smiling at me like they meant it. After a few days of walking the streets and eating food I couldn't name and feeling something almost close to curiosity, I decided I needed structure. Routine had always steadied me. So I joined a gym near the hotel, a clean, well-equipped place with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and a front desk that smelled like eucalyptus. That was where I met Yvonne Lara. She was one of the fitness instructors there. I noticed her the first day because she had that rare quality of making whoever she was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. I watched her work with a client twice her age, patiently demonstrating a movement, laughing softly at something the woman said, touching her shoulder with a kind of easy warmth that seemed completely genuine. She wasn't performing. At least, that was what I told myself. On my second visit, she introduced herself, asked about my fitness goals, offered to put together a simple routine for me since I had a bad left knee. I said yes. That was the beginning. We started talking after sessions. At first it was nothing, small things, how I liked Manila, what the weather was like in Florida, whether I preferred rice or pasta. She had a way of listening that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't felt in years. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't distracted. She looked at me with full attention and responded like what I said actually mattered to her. I know now what that was. I know it was a technique, whether conscious or not. But back then, after 5 years of feeling invisible in my own life, It felt like being given water after a very long drought. I told her about Barbara after about 2 weeks. I don't know why I did it so quickly. Something about the way she asked, "Do you have family back home?" made me want to be honest with her. I told her my wife had passed. She didn't rush to say something comforting the way people usually do. She just got quiet for a moment and said, "That must have been very hard." That was all, those 5 words. And I felt something loosen in my chest that had been locked tight for 5 years. I went back to my hotel that night and cried for the first time since Barbara's funeral. By the end of the first month, Yvonne and I were spending time together outside the gym. She showed me neighborhoods I never would have found on my own, took me to a small restaurant where the fish was fresh and the owner knew her by name. I walked with me along the bay at dusk, when the light came down, gold and warm over the water. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Not just comfort, something warmer than comfort. I told myself it was too soon. I told myself to be careful. I had lived long enough to know that grief does strange things to a person's judgment. But then she would say something, or look at me a certain way, and all those careful thoughts would dissolve. She moved in with me 6 weeks after we met. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then. When I mentioned it to Patrick on our Sunday call, keeping it casual, mentioning that I had a friend who would be staying with me for a while, I could hear the pause before he responded. He said, "A friend? Dad, you've been there 2 months." I told him she was just a friend and changed the subject. That was the first lie I told my son, and it came so easily that it frightened me a little. But not enough to stop. Living with Yvonne felt, for the first weeks, like something I had not allowed myself to imagine since Barbara died. The apartment was full of small, ordinary sounds, again someone moving in the kitchen, music from another room, a voice calling out to ask if I wanted coffee. She cooked for me on the night she wasn't working. She laughed easily, touched my arm when she talked to me, remembered things I had mentioned once and brought them up later in ways that made me feel seen. I stopped thinking of myself as a grieving widower. With her, I could just be Russell. Just a man. Just a person living his life. It was the most powerful feeling I had experienced in years, and I understand now that I should have been more suspicious of how powerful it was. The first time she asked me for money, it was presented so gently that I barely registered it as a request. We were sitting together one evening after dinner, and she told me about a business idea she had been working on for a long time, a small wellness studio of her own, combining fitness instruction with the kind of Filipino healing traditions she had grown up with. She talked about it with a quiet excitement that felt real and earned. She said she had most of what she needed, but there was a gap in the funding, a shortfall in the startup capital she had been saving for. She wasn't asking me directly. She mentioned it the way you might mention a dream to someone you trust, leaving the next move entirely to them. I offered. I want to be absolutely clear about that. She did not demand. She did not push. She simply shared something personal, and I offered. I told her I believed in her idea, which was true. I told her I wanted to help, which was also true. The amount was $85,000. I transferred it from my savings account within a week. I had been a careful man with money my entire professional life. I had spent 40 years as an accountant, watching other people make financial mistakes I would never make. And I transferred $85,000 to a woman I had known for 2 months without asking for a single piece of documentation or a single specific plan. I told myself it was generosity. I told myself Barbara would have understood. She had always been the more generous one between us, always finding ways to give to people around her. I think I was trying to honor that somehow. Or maybe I was just trying to feel like her again, like the man she had loved, the man who was still capable of caring about another person. I'm not sure anymore. What I know is that I did not allow myself to think too carefully about what I was doing, because somewhere underneath all the warmth I was feeling, there was a voice that knew, and I silenced that voice deliberately every time it tried to speak. The second request came about 2 months later. Yvonne came to me one afternoon looking shaken, more distressed than I had seen her before. She told me her mother was seriously ill, something with her kidneys, and the family was facing medical costs they couldn't cover. She had 3 siblings, she explained, and they had all contributed what they could, but it still wasn't enough. She was quiet and ashamed as she told me, as if the asking humiliated her. That shame felt so real to me. I had no reason to doubt it. I gave her $95,000. She cried and held my hand and said things I will not repeat here because they still reach something inside me that I am not proud of. After that, I called Melissa. I didn't tell her the full picture. I said I had been helping a friend with some family medical expenses, that it was a private matter, and that I was fine. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, are you in a relationship with someone?" I told her I had made a friend. She said, "Please be careful." I told her I was always careful. 2 weeks later, I transferred $95,000 and did not call her again for a month. The third request was larger, $120,000. Yvonne told me about a property investment, a piece of land outside Manila that she had been watching for years, that a contact of hers was offering at a price that would not be available for long. She explained that the property would appreciate significantly, that it was the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice, and that she had never been in a financial position to act on it until now. She talked about our future. She used that word "our." She said she wanted to build something real, something that we would both benefit from, that this was not about asking but about building together. That word, "together," did something to me that I cannot fully explain. I had not been a we with anyone for 5 years. I gave her the $120,000. By this point, nearly 9 months had passed since I arrived in Manila. I had extended my stay twice, rented the apartment on a longer lease, and told my children that I was happy, which I believed I was, or something close to it. I was not thinking about the money the way a rational person thinks about money. I was thinking about it the way a man in love thinks about it, which is to say I was not thinking about it at all. I had placed all of my emotional logic into the idea that what Yvonne and I had was real, and once I had committed to that idea so completely, every financial decision became a supporting argument for the thing I needed to believe. Accountants understand this pattern in other people. I could not see it in myself. The fourth request was the one that should have stopped me, $75,000, with no explanation beyond what she described as personal reasons she said she wasn't ready to share yet, but that she would explain when the time was right. She looked at me directly when she said it, and told me that she needed me to trust her. That was the entirety of the request. Trust me. I did. I gave her the $75,000. She said she would explain everything soon. She never did. Around that time, I began to notice things I had been actively not noticing for months. She was on her phone more often when she thought I wasn't watching. There were calls she took in the bedroom with the door closed that she explained afterward as work calls or family calls. Twice I tried to visit the gym where she still claimed to be working, and each time she discouraged me, saying it would be awkward for her professionally if I showed up. A man she introduced me to at a restaurant one evening, a younger Filipino man, perhaps 35, was explained as a cousin. The explanation came before I had even asked who he was. I remember thinking it was odd that she had already prepared the answer. I started to feel something I recognized from my years doing audits, a quiet wrongness beneath the surface of things, the sense that numbers that should add up don't. But I had too much invested, not just the money, the belief, the story I had been telling myself about who I was and what this was. If I admitted something was wrong, I had to admit how wrong and how far back the wrongness went. I was not ready to do that. So I stayed quiet and kept my suspicions to myself and watched her with new eyes while pretending I was seeing the same things I had always seen. It was Patrick who finally made me stop. He flew to Manila in January without telling me he was coming. He showed up at the apartment door with a carry-on bag and an expression I recognized, the same face I used to make when I found an error in a client's books that was too large to ignore. He sat down with me at the kitchen table while Yvonne was at work, and he put his phone down in front of me. On the screen was my bank account statement. He had asked my bank to flag unusual transactions and had been named on the account as an emergency contact years ago, something I had completely forgotten. He had been watching for months, saying nothing, hoping I would come to him myself. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just said, "Dad, $375,000. I need you to tell me what's happening. And sitting across from my son at that kitchen table, seeing that number laid out in black and white, I couldn't pretend anymore. Not to him. Not to myself. $375,000. It was sitting there in front of me like a verdict. I tried to explain. I told him about Yvonne, about the business, about her mother's illness, about the property. I heard myself talking and I heard how it sounded, and the shame was so heavy I could barely breathe through it. Patrick listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said quietly, "Dad, there is no studio. There is no property. I had someone check. The address she gave you for the land doesn't correspond to any registered parcel under her name or any name connected to her. And I talked to someone at the gym. She left that job 4 months ago. I sat there and said nothing. There was nothing to say. I confronted Yvonne that evening. I had decided I would be calm. I had decided I would ask simple, direct questions and listen to the answers and try to understand what had actually happened. But the moment she walked in and looked at me, and I saw in that first split second that she already knew something had shifted, all the calm I had prepared dissolved. I told her what Patrick had told me. I asked about the property. I asked about the studio. I asked about her mother. I asked about the man at the restaurant. She didn't fall apart. That surprised me more than anything else about that night. She didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't try to construct an elaborate counter-story. She sat down across from me with a kind of tired stillness and said, "Russell, I'm sorry. Just that. I'm sorry. I waited for more." She said, "Things got more complicated than I planned." I asked her what that meant. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "You wanted so badly to be taken care of. I let you believe I was the one doing it." Then she stood up, picked up the bag she had already packed. I hadn't noticed it in the bedroom when I came in, and she walked out. I sat in that apartment for 3 days without calling anyone. I ate almost nothing. I replayed every conversation I could remember, looking for the moments where I should have seen it clearly, and there were so many that it became a kind of punishment I was administering to myself. The $85,000 for the studio, the $95,000 for her mother's medical bills, the $120,000 for land that did not exist, the $75,000 for reasons she never explained, $375,000 gone. My retirement savings, my security, the financial foundation I had spent 40 years building reduced by nearly half in less than a year. But the money, as strange as this sounds, was not the worst of it. The worst of it was what I understood about myself in those 3 days alone. I understood that I had not fallen in love with Yvonne. I had fallen in love with the feeling of not grieving. She had given me permission to stop feeling the loss of Barbara, and I had mistaken that permission for love. I had been so desperate to escape what I was carrying that I had handed everything I owned, everything I was, to the first person who offered me a door out of that pain. And in doing so, I had done something that shamed me in a way the money never could. I had tried to replace Barbara, not consciously, not cruelly, but that is what it was. I had taken 41 years of real, earned, lived love and tried to stuff the hole it left with something that had never been real at all. And Barbara deserved better than that. She had deserved someone who could hold her memory with dignity, and I had not done that. Patrick came back to the apartment on the 4th day. He didn't say much. He made coffee and sat with me and let me talk without trying to fix anything. At some point I told him I was sorry, not for the money, but for the Sunday morning calls where I had lied, for Melissa's worried voice that I had brushed aside, for the way I had chosen to believe a stranger over my own children. He said, "Dad, you were hurting. You didn't know how to ask for help." I told him I still didn't. He said, "I know, but you're asking now." Melissa flew in the following week. She sat beside me on the couch and held my hand and didn't cry until she thought I wasn't looking. We talked about Barbara, really talked, for the first time since the funeral. We talked about what the 5 years had actually been like for all of us, not just me. We talked about what I needed, which was not a therapist's answer or a doctor's prescription, but just the truth of what was missing. And what was missing was this: people who loved me, who knew me, who could see when I was drowning and had the right to say so. I had come to the Philippines to escape that love because it reminded me of loss. That had been my mistake, long before Yvonne. I stayed in Manila 2 more weeks to deal with the practical things, speaking with a lawyer, reporting what had happened to the appropriate authorities, not because I believed I would recover a single dollar, but because I needed to do something concrete. The lawyer was a quietly serious man who had heard versions of this story before. He told me, carefully and without unkindness, that the chances of financial recovery in a case like mine were very low. He said it in a way that made clear he thought I needed to hear the truth more than I needed false hope. I thanked him and meant it. False hope was the thing that had cost me everything. I flew home to Tampa in February. The flight was long, and I sat by the window and watched the ocean and the clouds and thought about Barbara the whole way. Not with guilt, for the first time in a long time, just with the simple, clean grief that I should have been allowing myself to feel all along instead of running from it. She would not have blamed me for what happened. She was not that kind of woman. She would have said something like, "Russell, you were just so lonely," and she would have been right. And that simple truth would have been both the wound and the bandage. Patrick drove me home from the airport. The house in Tampa felt smaller than I remembered, quieter. The chair was still there, the kitchen table, the faint arrangement of a life that had been built with someone else, designed for 2, now occupied by 1. I sat down in the chair that first night, and I did not try to feel anything other than what I actually felt. I was tired. I was sad. I was humbled in a way that I had never been in my professional life, never in my adult life. I had been a careful man, and I had not been careful. I had been a smart man, and I had been foolish. I had been a good husband, and I had not honored that, but I was also still here, 73 years old, sitting in my chair, with my son's number in my phone and my daughter's voice still in my ear from the airport goodbye. The money was gone. I would not pretend otherwise. $375,000 was a loss that would reshape what the rest of my life looked like, practically what I could afford, what options I had, how much buffer I had built between me and uncertainty. Those were real consequences, and I did not minimize them, but I was still here. That was something. I started going to a grief counselor in March, not because Patrick suggested it, though he did, not because Melissa asked me to, though she asked. I went because I finally understood, sitting in that apartment in Manila in the days after Yvonne left, that the grief I had been carrying since 2018 was never going to release me until I turned toward it directly. I had spent 5 years moving around it, avoiding it, and finally running from it all the way to the other side of the world, and it had followed me every step. Grief does not stay behind. It goes wherever you go. The only way out of it is through it. I know that now, with a certainty, I could not have arrived at any other way. My counselor's name is Dr. Reyes, which I find quietly ironic given where I have just come from. She is patient and direct in equal measure, and she has a gift for asking the question that goes exactly to the center of what I am avoiding. In our 3rd session, she asked me what I missed most about Barbara, and I started to answer with something about her laugh or her cooking, the easy, safe answers, and then I stopped and told the truth. I said I missed feeling like someone was glad I existed. I missed the daily quiet confirmation that my presence in the world mattered to someone. That was what Yvonne had offered me, and that was what I had paid $375,000 for. Not love, not companionship, not even warmth, just the feeling of mattering. Just that. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you understand that your children could have given you that, if you had let them?" And I thought about Patrick at the kitchen table with the bank statement. I thought about Melissa crying when she thought I wasn't looking. I thought about 5 years of Sunday calls that I had kept carefully surface level, never once saying what was true, which was that I was drowning in my own house and too proud to ask for a hand. I said yes. I understood. I had not understood before, but I did now. There is a version of this story where I am only the victim, an old man who was exploited by a younger woman who understood his vulnerability better than he did. That version is partly true. Yvonne saw me clearly. She saw my grief, my loneliness, my need, and she positioned herself inside all of it with a skill that I can only describe as professional. The requests were timed carefully. The emotional warmth was calibrated. The shame she performed when asking for money was designed to disarm my suspicion, and it worked every time, because it was exactly the kind of shame Barbara would have felt, and I responded to it the way I would have responded to Barbara. That was not an accident. That was craft. But the other version of this story is also true. I was not just a victim. I was a man who chose not to see what was in front of him because the alternative was too painful. I silenced the voice that knew. I lied to my children to protect the story I was telling myself. I transferred $375,000 in 4 separate transactions to a woman I had known for less than a year, and I did not ask for a single receipt, a single proof of claim, a single piece of paper. I was an accountant. I knew what due diligence looked like. I chose not to apply it. I chose that every single time. Owning that is the hardest part of what I am doing in this counselor's office every week. And it is also, I think, the only part that will actually heal me. I am not writing this for sympathy. I am not writing this for warnings. Though if there is a man reading this who recognizes himself who is lonely, who is grieving, who has found someone warm and attentive in a foreign place, and is telling himself, it's different, it's real. This one is different, then I am asking you to stop. Not because all foreign relationships are dangerous. Not because love is impossible later in life, in strange places, and with unexpected people, but because grief is not a compass. Grief points toward relief. It does not point toward truth. And the relief I found in Manila was purchased, not earned, and everything I paid for it was gone before I understood what I was buying. Barbara would have told me that in the first month. She was always smarter than me about people. She had a way of watching someone's face while they talked and knowing exactly who they were before the conversation was over. She would have watched Yvonne and known. She would have taken my hand on the walk back from the restaurant and said, gently, that she wasn't sure about that one. I would have laughed and told her she was being protective. She would have been right. I miss her every day. I miss her in the right way now, not as an absence I am trying to fill, but as a presence that shaped who I am and does not require replacement. She was 41 years of my life. That doesn't go away when someone dies. It changes shape. It hurts differently over time. It sits in different places inside you as the years pass, but it does not go away. She is still with me. In the careful way I balance my remaining accounts. In the Sunday calls with Patrick that are now longer and more honest than they have ever been. In the way I let Melissa hug me at the airport without stepping back first. In the chair where I sit every morning with my coffee, not running from anything, not hiding from the quiet, just sitting with it the way she would have wanted me to sit, present, still, alive. $375,000. That is what it cost me to learn that grief requires patience, not escape. That loneliness requires honesty, not substitution. That love, real love, the kind that lasts 41 years and changes the shape of who you are, cannot be replaced. It can only be honored. And the way to honor it is not to run from the pain it leaves behind. The way to honor it is to sit with that pain long enough to understand what it is telling you and to let the people who love you sit with you while you do. I am 73 years old. I am a widower. I am a retired accountant who let himself be taken for $375,000. I am a man who is still learning how to grieve properly after 7 years of refusing to. I am a father whose children drove to airports and booked flights they didn't tell me about because they loved me more than I knew how to accept. I am all of these things, and I am still here, still sitting in this chair, still showing up for the Sunday calls. Still, after everything, grateful to be alive in a world that Barbara once moved, through a world that is quieter without her, harder without her, less bright without her, but still worth being present in. That, in the end, is what she would have wanted. Not for me to grieve perfectly, or wisely, or without mistakes. Just for me to keep showing up. I am trying to do that. Some days, it is enough.